They voted for it, they cheered for it, they wore the red hats for it, and now Trump supporters are about to learn that the big beautiful bill is going to devastate their lives more than anyone else's. There is a special kind of poetic justice unfolding right now across America, and I want to take a moment to break down exactly what's happening with Trump's so-called big beautiful bill. This massive piece of legislation that Trump and his supporters celebrated as a triumph is about to become the most painful lesson in political consequences that working-class white America has received in generations. And here's the part that makes this situation so darkly fascinating. The people who will be hurt most by this bill are the exact people who voted for it, campaigned for it, and convinced themselves that Trump was looking out for them. Let's start with the healthcare provisions, because this is where the devastation is going to be most immediate and most visible. The big beautiful bill makes massive cuts to Medicaid, fundamentally restructures Medicare, and eliminates the Affordable Care Act's protections for people with pre-existing conditions. Now, if you listen to the rhetoric, you might think these cuts primarily impact Black and brown communities. And yes, communities of color will absolutely be affected. But here's the statistical reality that Trump supporters either don't know or chose to ignore. White Americans make up the majority of Medicaid recipients in this country. Let me give you the actual numbers so we're clear about what's happening. Approximately 43% of Medicaid recipients are white, non-Hispanic Americans. That's roughly 30 million white Americans who depend on Medicaid for their health care. These are people in rural communities, people in economically depressed areas of the Rust Belt and Appalachia, people who have been devastated by the opioid crisis, people who work low-wage jobs without employer-provided health insurance. These are Trump's base voters, and they're about to lose their health care coverage. The Medicaid cuts in the big beautiful bill are not subtle. We're talking about work requirements that will kick millions off the program, funding caps that will force states to restrict eligibility, and the elimination of coverage for services that rural hospitals depend on to stay open. When those rural hospitals close, and they will close because they cannot survive without Medicaid reimbursements, white Americans in small towns across the country will have to drive hours to access basic medical care. Emergency rooms will disappear. Maternity wards will shut down. Cancer treatment will become inaccessible. Let's talk about what this means for the opioid crisis specifically, because this is devastating. White communities have been hit hardest by opioid addiction, and Medicaid has been covering a significant portion of addiction treatment services. Medication-assisted treatment, counseling, rehabilitation programs, all of this has been funded through Medicaid expansion. The big beautiful bill guts these programs. People who are currently in recovery will lose access to the medications and support services keeping them alive. People who need treatment won't be able to access it. The death toll in white communities is going to skyrocket, and it will be a direct consequence of policies that white voters supported. Now let's examine Medicare, because this is where older Trump supporters are going to feel the impact personally and immediately. The big beautiful bill raises the eligibility age for Medicare from 65 to 67, reduces benefits, and increases out-of-pocket costs for seniors. Who depends on Medicare most? Older Americans, and older Americans are disproportionately white and disproportionately Trump supporters. These are the people at his rallies, the ones who believed he was going to protect their benefits. Instead, he's making their health care more expensive and less accessible. The Medicare cuts mean higher premiums, higher deductibles, and reduced coverage for services that seniors depend on. Prescription drug costs are going to increase substantially. The bill eliminates caps on out-of-pocket expenses, which means that a serious illness could bankrupt seniors who thought they were protected by Medicare. Hip replacements, cancer treatment, cardiac care, all of it is going to become financially devastating for people on fixed incomes. Here's where the psychology of this situation becomes interesting. Trump supporters convinced themselves that when politicians talked about cutting entitlements, they meant cutting benefits for other people, for lazy people, for people who didn't deserve help. They never imagined that they were the entitlements. They never connected the dots between their own Medicaid coverage and the government programs that Republicans constantly vilified. They thought of themselves as hardworking Americans who had earned their benefits, completely different from those other people who were gaming the system. This cognitive dissonance is about to shatter against the reality of empty prescription bottles and canceled medical appointments. When they can't afford their insulin, when they can't get their chemotherapy, when they have to choose between paying rent and paying for heart medication, they're going to realize that the government programs they voted to cut were the same programs keeping them alive. Let's move to the economic provisions of the big beautiful bill, because the healthcare disaster is just the beginning. The bill includes massive tax cuts for corporations and wealthy individuals paid for by eliminating tax credits and deductions that working-class and middle-class Americans depend on. The child tax credit is reduced. The earned income tax credit is restructured in ways that benefit fewer people. Deductions for mortgage interest and state and local taxes are capped at levels that hurt homeowners in exactly the communities that voted for Trump. Think about what this means for a working-class white family in Ohio or Pennsylvania. They're going to see their taxes increase while watching billionaires and corporations get massive tax breaks. The factory jobs that Trump promised to bring back are still gone, and now the tax refund they counted on every year is gone too. The financial pressure on these families is going to intensify dramatically, and there's no relief coming because the same bill that raised their taxes cut funding for every social program that might have helped them. The big beautiful bill also cuts funding for infrastructure in rural areas, which is going to devastate the communities that gave Trump his strongest support. Rural roads that are already falling apart won't get repaired. Bridges that are structurally deficient won't get fixed. Broadband internet expansion that might have brought economic opportunities to isolated areas won't happen. These communities are going to become even more economically isolated and depressed, and the people living there voted for exactly this outcome. Education funding is another area where Trump supporters are going to experience immediate negative consequences. The bill cuts federal funding for public schools, eliminates programs that support students from low-income families, and redirects money toward private school vouchers that won't actually help most families in rural and working-class communities. The public schools that white children in these areas attend are going to lose teachers, cut programs, eliminate sports and arts, and generally provide a worse education. The vouchers that were supposed to provide choice won't be enough to cover private school tuition, and there often aren't even private schools in rural areas to choose from. Meanwhile, the special education services that many families depend on are being cut. Speech therapy, occupational therapy, counseling services for students with behavioral challenges, all of this is funded through federal programs that the big beautiful bill reduces or eliminates. Parents of children with disabilities who voted for Trump are going to discover that their children's educational support is disappearing, and they're going to have to fight school districts that no longer have the funding to provide legally required services. Let's talk about the agricultural provisions, because this is where rural Trump supporters are going to get hit in their economic livelihoods. The bill cuts farm subsidies, eliminates crop insurance programs, and reduces support for agricultural research and development. Family farms that are already operating on thin margins are going to go bankrupt. The consolidation of American agriculture into massive corporate operations is going to accelerate, and the independent farmers who thought Trump was protecting them are going to lose their land and their way of life. The irony here is almost too perfect. Trump campaigned on protecting American farmers and bringing back rural prosperity. His supporters believed he understood their struggles and would fight for them. Instead, the policies in the big beautiful bill are going to destroy family farming and hand even more power to the agricultural corporations that are already squeezing independent farmers out of existence. Social Security is also in the crosshairs, though the changes are structured in ways designed to minimize immediate political backlash. The bill changes the formula for calculating cost of living adjustments, which means Social Security benefits will grow more slowly than the actual cost of living. Over time, this will erode the purchasing power of Social Security checks, making it harder for retirees to afford basic necessities. Again, this disproportionately impacts white seniors who form a core part of Trump's base. The disability insurance provisions are being tightened, making it much harder to qualify for benefits and much easier to lose benefits once you have them. White working-class Americans in physically demanding jobs who become disabled are going to find themselves without income and without health care, unable to work but unable to access the safety net programs they paid into their entire working lives. Now, I want to address why the big beautiful bill will hurt white Americans more than black Americans. And this requires understanding the demographic and economic realities of how these programs function. Black communities have already been systematically excluded from many of these benefits through decades of discriminatory policy implementation. We've already faced the welfare reform that made assistance harder to access. We've already navigated healthcare systems that underserve us. We've already built survival strategies in communities where government support is minimal. This is not to say that Black Americans won't be hurt by these cuts. We absolutely will be. But proportionally, white Americans have more to lose because they've had greater access to these programs and have depended on them more heavily without recognizing that dependence. When you don't realize that you're receiving government assistance because you think of it as something you earned or something you're entitled to as opposed to a government program, losing it comes as a much more devastating shock. Black Americans also tend to have stronger community support networks that we've built out of necessity. We've had to create mutual aid systems, community care structures, and informal safety nets because we've never been able to fully rely on government programs. White communities, particularly rural white communities, haven't had to build those same networks because they had better access to government support. When that support disappears, they don't have the community infrastructure to fall back on. Let me also point out the political calculation that makes this even more interesting. Trump and the Republicans who supported the big beautiful bill assumed that their base would either not understand the policy details or would blame Democrats and immigrants for the consequences. They counted on cultural resentment and racial anxiety to override economic self-interest. They believed that as long as they promised to hurt the right people, their supporters would accept being hurt themselves. There's a famous quote that captures this dynamic perfectly. If you can convince the lowest white man he's better than the best colored man, he won't notice you're picking his pocket. Hell, give him somebody to look down on and he'll empty his pockets for you. That's exactly the strategy that the big beautiful bill represents. Promise to hurt immigrants and Black people, and white voters will support policies that devastate their own communities. But here's where that strategy might finally backfire. You can only run that play so many times before people notice that their lives are actually getting worse. When their grandmother can't afford her medications, when their brother dies from an overdose because he couldn't access treatment, when they lose their family farm, when their kid's school has to cut half its teachers, at some point the abstract satisfaction of thinking other people are being hurt worse stops compensating for their own suffering. The question is whether Trump supporters will make the connection between their vote and their pain. Will they recognize that the big beautiful bill that they celebrated is directly responsible for their healthcare crisis and economic decline? Or will they find ways to blame someone else, to argue that the bill would have worked if only it had been implemented differently, to convince themselves that they're suffering for some greater good? Based on human psychology and political tribalism, many of them will struggle to admit they were wrong. Acknowledging that you voted for policies that harmed yourself and your family requires a level of self-reflection and intellectual honesty that most people find extremely difficult. It's psychologically easier to find alternative explanations, to blame scapegoats, to argue that the situation would be even worse under different leadership. But some of them, maybe enough of them, will wake up. They'll realize that the politicians they trusted betrayed them. They'll understand that cultural resentment and racial anxiety were used to manipulate them into supporting policies that served the wealthy at their expense. They'll recognize that they have more in common economically with the Black Americans and immigrants they were taught to resent than they do with the billionaires and corporations that funded the politicians they elected. The bottom line is this: the big beautiful bill is going to devastate working class and middle class white Americans in ways that are immediate, personal, and undeniable. Healthcare coverage will disappear, costs will skyrocket, economic security will erode, communities will decline, and all of this will happen because Trump supporters believed the promises and voted for their own destruction. They chose cultural grievance over economic self-interest, and now they're going to live with the consequences. The tragedy is that their suffering was entirely preventable and entirely self-inflicted. The question now is whether they'll learn from it or whether they'll find new scapegoats to blame for the pain they voted to experience.